It was Albert Schweitzer who once said, "At times our own light goes out, but is rekindled into flame by the light of another human being. Each of us owes deepest thanks to those who have rekindled this light within us." John Brooks Dodge kindled such a light. Now we too are called to rekindle his light for one another. Dear family and friends, we have come together today from many places to commemorate the life of John Dodge. He was a husband, father, stepfather, son, brother, uncle, grandfather, great-grandfather, and dear friend to so many. We are here today to mourn John's passing, to hear tributes and remembrances, and to celebrate the spirit of a life that has uplifted our own. My name is Megan Lines. I'm one of the ministers here at the First Parish in Bedford, and on behalf of the congregation of First Parish, of which John was a member, I welcome you to this historic meeting house. But I should also say that what makes a church real is not the building, but the people who build the beloved community. And that was really John's mission and legacy. And so, to this community of beloveds and on behalf of the Dodge family, I welcome you. And I thank you for being here this morning. We include also in our welcome the friends and family who would be here if they could be, and all those we remember in spirit. As Abraham Lincoln once said, "In the end, it is not the years in your life that count, it is the life in your years." Few people better embody that saying than John, who at 93 lived and loved enough to span 10 lifetimes. 3 years ago, near his 90th birthday, he remarked, "If I went today, I'd have no regrets. I've lived a wonderful life. I've had more laughs and more fun than probably anyone should, and I've known so many great people." So, in a way, we know he himself was at peace with his life and his death. Still, today marks a part of a journey for us. A journey perhaps from the sense of grief or loss towards John's sense of peace and acceptance, joining in a shared affection and abiding regard for a man whose life profoundly touched so many, many people. There are qualities of John's life that were public and well known, and you're going to hear a lot about that from a variety of different people today. He was truly the quintessential Bedford citizen, a keeper and teller of stories and the town historian, a man who led with warmth and humility and was a friend to everyone. And yet each of you will also have memories of him that are very specific to his relationship with you. All of these thoughts are really more than memories. They are realities and they last. John is a region in the landscape of who you are and who you will be. Whenever someone we have loved dies, it leaves a place in our minds and in our hearts that cannot be filled again in quite the same way. This is the meaning of love, that we cannot replace each other. All that we have would not be beautiful if we did not cherish it enough to feel very deeply when it is lost. With the loss of John, our lives are already different. Sometimes with loss comes a regretful recounting in your minds and in your hearts of all the acts of kindness you now feel you should have performed for John, and perhaps all of the things you wish you had said to him and never did. I ask you not to live with these regrets. Remember, they are only love's way of acknowledging that we can never do enough for those we cherish. So today, let there be stories, memories, photographs, and prints, colored prints, and word pictures of John, which will kindle another story for another person, and other pictures in other minds and hearts. This is a part of mourning, a part of remembering. This is a step in the journey toward honoring him by living our lives as he would want us to live them, in creative, cooperative faithfulness to the better beckonings of our human condition. And let there be room for tears, if that is what you feel, for tears at a time like this are an expression of our love. And let there be laughter, if it comes, for John loved a good laugh, like that stuffed coyote at the funeral home steps yesterday that scared the dickens out of me. And I think that kind of thing he loved to do just to get our goat a little bit. And let there be music, for John loved that too. Our pianist this morning is Bob Tyler. Can barely see you over the top of that piano. Good to see you, Bob. Thank you for playing. And Bob is incorporating some of John's favorites throughout the service. We meet here in the presence of death to honor the spirit of life. Our voices may be the voices of grief, but the language is the language of love. And we'll sing. We're going to sing Abide With Me, which is a comforting hymn. It's in your hymnals in front of you in the pews, and it's number 101. And I invite you to stand as you're willing and able. Please be seated. The Reverend Charles Gaines says, "No person can sum up the life of another. Life is too precious to be passed over with mere words which ring empty. Rather, it must remain as it is remembered by those who loved and watched and shared. For such memories are alive, unbound by events of birth and death. And as living memories, we possess the greatest gift one person can give another." So in a little bit, there will be a chance for folks to recount a memory you might have of John and share it. And I've been sent so many newspaper articles, clippings that people kept that were highlights of John Dodge's history in this town, and personal snippets from the life he shared with Fran, his first wife of 49 years. They grew up here in Bedford, and also stories of Connie and John's life now, and the collections of historic documents that they compiled, and all of those documents that are billowing out from the downstairs of the Bedford Police Department. They're just trying to keep it under wraps, but John was a person who collected things and he collected historic documents, but he also collected people who knew and loved him. And so in this room, there are 1,000 stories, and I've actually tried to weed out some of the ones that I might share to make some more room for you. So there are so many things that could be said about John, of his jovial nature, his deep love of family, the natural world and civil society, his strong hands that worked on cars and coloring his own prints and drawings, those drawings and prints that went all over the world to Japan and Saudi Arabia and here in Boston. The hardworking and dedicated ways that he gave to people in this town and beyond, all of the things he did for folks who were homeless or veterans, the ways he would help with Bedford Santa or in giving a ride to a vet anytime he drove up the Great Road. He'd see someone trying to get up to the VA and he'd just say, come on in, you can get in, and he'd give people a ride. He just had a very golden heart. And I got to know him a little bit over the past 7 years. I came here, this is my 8th year. And he was one of those people who had a light within him, as you know, because you're here in this room, that he had within him that he wanted to share with others. He couldn't keep it down. He just loved people, and he made other people want to love other people. And there's just a beautiful aspect, an innate aspect of his personality. We should speak of his enthusiasm for tinkering and creating things, and for all of the things he created out of being born in and living through the period of the Great Depression, where every tiny little thing that you saved made a difference to yourself or someone else. Bedford used to have a farm where people who were very poor could live on it. And he kept that spirit of understanding what it was like to be down and out alive by starting something along with St. Francis House to collect coats and be sure to give people who were cold in the winter something warm. And I think a lot of people here in Bedford remember him hanging the scarves out on the fences and the trees to attract attention. So he'd sit there wrapped in a blanket, and he did it for, I think, something like 30 years. And people donated coats, and it just feels good to give because it's the right thing to do, but it also is a reminder to keep your heart that open. And he was a person who reminded us about that. We should be sure to talk about all of the historic documents that he uncovered and dove into and created himself. And all of those were either in writing or prints that he carefully handmade and then would sit and color them in. And a lot of people in this room have different varieties of collections of his paintings and his etchings and drawings. You can see some of those. I know the Bedford Historical Society has been generous enough to bring quite a few things over, and so after our service we have a collation in the common room to which all are most warmly invited, and we hope you'll have a look at some of those documents brought by his family and by the Historical Society. And as I said this morning at John's committal over at Shawsheen Cemetery, we give thanks for the life of John Dodge. John, who loved his family, those who raised him here in Bedford where he grew up, and those whom he raised with Fran, his children Julie and Rick, and the beloveds he chose as a family later in the later chapter of his life, Connie, and that whole extended family that created for both of them through Connie, their children Margaret and Gail, and all of the people he chose also as his beloved ones, his family, and a lot of people felt that they were part of the family that we call Bedford, and all of that extends past Bedford. John, who was the Bedford town historian and a preserver and teller of stories, all those stories that could make you laugh because he had a mind like a steel trap, and also because sometimes he was just crass. And he did it in a very funny way. He never embarrassed people with stories. He just sort of went about telling it how, what was it? Some kind of well, maybe I shouldn't tell it. The outhouse over near where the Bedford, the bikeway, someone will tell this story. You should definitely swim upstream. Anyway, that was the story. John, who was a professional artist and illustrator and watercolorist, whose art is now dispersed around the globe, and who was a founding member of the Bedford Arts and Crafts Society. John, who was a citizen, a true citizen, always ready to serve, whether with St. Francis House Shelter collecting coats, the Bedford Santa program, or with the Bedford Minutemen themselves. John, who had a wicked sense of humor, loved to pull a prank, and he would always say that the world needs more laughter. John was a collector, whether it was cars or antique prints, historic records, or valentines from the last century. I hear there were just thousands of valentines from the first time that valentines started being created. John was a patriot who served in World War II, and I hear that he once shot at a rabbit for dinner because rations were scarce, and found to his surprise that 18 German soldiers were suddenly stepping out from the bushes to surrender to him because they would rather be caught by the Americans than the Russians. John, who was truly a good citizen of town and country, a humanitarian without making a very big deal about it, and someone who made others want to do the right thing by following in his footsteps. John, whose spirit was radical welcome and would not stand for intolerance, and who picketed against hate-filled Fred Phelps, who brought his anti-gay agenda here to Bedford. John, who was dedicated to the common good and who had a tender and generous heart for the poor or unfortunate, and set about to change their lot in life. And as we know, when you do something for others, it sometimes changes you more than it even changes their life. John, who kept up with friends and family near and far, making each one feel loved and treasured. And I know David Pohl, who was a minister here in the 50s, is here in the room today, and he said, for years, John Dodge would just call, and I want to connect with him and his wife, Martha, many years after the fact. He just had a habit of reaching out and making someone know that they were thought about constantly in his mind. John, who believed in the dignity of every human being and offered respect to all who entered his kind and smiling presence. John, who saw his beloved town of Bedford through all the changes of the years and who understood about the circle of life and finding one's place in the grand order of things. John, who was truly humble and grand. So John was our town historian, but he was no reciter of colorless names and dates. He brought color to our history, as when he recalled the town meeting discussion about replacing a local bridge. When a townsman scoffed and said this body of water was so narrow, he could pee halfway across it. And this was declared promptly out of order by the moderator, and John replied, "Well, if I wasn't out of order, I could pee the whole way across it." He literally brought color to our history when he sketched our historic buildings and hand-colored antique photographs. His stories tell about the time lightning struck the church and what he and his father did to protect it. Not only did he tell us his stories, but he helped others tell their stories as well, such as when he hosted a panel of other veterans on Bedford TV recalling memories of World War II. When funny things happened in church, which is rather often, John would say that laughter is what the world needs more of. He spoke so often for his love of this town and its people, his love for his son and daughter, for Fran and all their growing up years together, and for his second wife, Connie, with whom he had a whole new lease on life, for his extended family and his love and care for people he may never have met, but who received his gifts, coats, and other collections he humbly collected every November for St. Francis House. His words were the words of St. Francis House, whose mission is, "We believe in the dignity of every human being and offer respect to all who enter the house." And we are so very lucky to have the founder here of St. Francis House with us today, Father Louis Camino. He's come all the way from North Carolina to be with us here, and we're so very grateful that you've come. We know how much John respected you, worked alongside of you, was inspired by you, and your mission and your love for the world really changes lives, and we're really lucky and grateful that you've come all the way up here. John believed in the dignity of every human being and offered respect to all who entered his kind and smiling presence. There's so much more I could say, but I want to let his loved ones say it from a more personal vantage point. So all of these memories are only broad brush strokes. You are the ones who know these stories best. And in a moment, you'll have a chance to recount some if you like. Whatever memories are floating about in your mind, whether you share them aloud today or not, they will always be yours to keep. But before we hear some of your memories of John, let us bring what is in our hearts into that light that shines beyond life and death and illumines both, and let us pray. O thou eternal source of all being, in whom our finite lives find both their beginning and their ending, we give thanks this day for the life of John Dodge, for the works of his hands, for the thoughts of his mind, for the aspirations of his spirit, for the affections of his heart. We understand that his body could not go on, and we are grateful that he is at peace. Let his name now be inscribed on the eternal tree of life, as we bring the tribute of our sorrow and the offering of our recollections in celebration of the interweaving of his life with all our lives, and as we pray forgiveness for any omissions of loving kindness, for any troublings of spirit we may have caused him. Grant us in this hour not only an awareness of the gifts received through his life, but also the self-knowledge that we too belong to the passing tide. Help us then, O God of many names, in the light of his life, to seek life while it may be found, not tarnishing our brief moments with envy, bitterness, or regret, but rather setting our sights on higher purpose. May we see this purpose plainly and build upon it, that the best within us may come to rule our lives, until we live as truly as we want to live, and our deeds become the answer to our prayers. Amen. And Father Louis is going to come on up here, and we have, yesterday we had a funny thing happen as folks set up in the Bedford funeral home. There was a little collection pot that was sort of symbolic of the life work that John did, and it was sitting out there to show donations for coats, and out sat this little collection bin. But people actually took it seriously, and so apparently we took up a collection, and I have that money to give to you, which I'll do afterwards, so you can take that home with you. Thank you.
I appreciate the opportunity to be invited to this memorial service. I'm sure many of you are asking, what's a Roman Catholic priest doing in a Unitarian church, and also a Franciscan priest? Well, friends, it goes back many, many years ago. It's in the 1980s. We Franciscans in downtown Boston, we borrowed over $1 million to buy a building so we could reach out to the poor and disenfranchised and the needy. We started with 12 staff people, and we only had 2 desks. John comes along, introduces himself, never met him before. He said, Father, I think it's great what you Franciscans and what you people are doing here for the poor. How can I help? Do you need some more food? At that time, a lot of congregations were giving us food. But I said, John, we don't have any desks for our staff, and we don't have too many chairs. He said, that's great. I'll do it. I'll get some stuff for you. Probably within a month, we had desks for every staff member, and we had chairs too that we could sit down on. Then from there, as Megan mentioned to you, he was responsible for the annual coat collection for the poor and the needy there. He had that jar, and I can't take that jar because the director of St. Francis, the present St. Francis House, is here, Karen LaFrasia, and so she might want that jar, okay? But for all these years, the amount of money that John collected for St. Francis House, the number of coats that took care of so many of the poor, especially during the winter months. Men and women who would have froze to death. But because of John, they had a sense of dignity and life. Friends, I tell the story that took place many, many years ago of Dr. Albert Einstein. He was on a train going to Princeton University to give a talk. And as he was on the train, the ticket captain came by to punch his ticket, and he was fumbling in his jacket to find the ticket, and he couldn't find it. And the ticket captain said, I'll be right back, don't worry. He went to the other train cars, and just before he left that car, a gentleman said, do you know who you were speaking to? He said, no, I have no idea. He says, that's the scientist, Dr. Albert Einstein. Oh, he said, I didn't know that. So, 10 minutes later, the ticket captain came by, and where is Dr. Albert Einstein at this time? But he's underneath the seat, fumbling, trying to find the ticket. And the ticket captain finally taps him on the shoulder. Did you find it yet? He said, no, I haven't, but I know it's here. And the ticket captain finally said to him, I know who you are. Don't worry about it. Einstein takes himself from under the seat, stares at the ticket captain and says, I know who I am also, but I don't know where I'm going. Friends and family, I think we could be very confident that we know where John is going or where he has gone to his new heavenly home with his Maker and Creator. Why? Why can we be confident in saying this? John had an incredible virtue and disposition of love. He had a tremendous love and concern for his dear wife, Connie. He loved his children and stepchildren as tenderly as he could. He loved his country. He loved his God in ways that might be slightly different than our expressions of faith. Colossians expresses it very well to me. You are God's chosen race, his saints. He loves you. And you should be clothed in sincere compassion, in kindness, in humility, in gentleness, and patience. Over all these clothes, to keep them together and complete, put on love. You and I know so very well that John Dodge put on love. How can we be confident that John is with his living God? He was an inspired artist who saw beauty in life and in God's creation and tried to capture that in his art. In other words, John recognized God as the master artist and the creator of beauty and wanted us to get a glimpse of this divine touch. Our confidence that John is with the Lord also comes from God's Word, which is all-powerful, convincing, and true. We read in the book of the Old Testament from wisdom these words: the souls of the just are in the hand of God, and no torment shall touch them. Oh yes, they seemed in view of the foolish to be dead, and their going forth from us was thought an affliction, and their going forth from us utter destruction. But they are in peace. They are in peace. Friends and family, the real clincher for me about knowing that John is with his loving God was the comment that was made to me by his stepdaughter, Margaret. She said, caring for others. And you know, this is not a bunch of words. This was John. Caring for others was the core of John's existence. So much so that when someone was downtrodden or in pain, he also felt their pain. What an incredible gift of compassion. What an incredible blessing. One of my favorite books, unfortunately it's out of print, and when I was studying at Duquesne University in spirituality, it's from a famous author, Adrian von Kahn. The book is called Religion and Personality. It's a paperback. If you and I were to read it, we can read it probably in an hour and a half. I spent, and I'm not a slow reader, I spent about 20 hours on it. Because the essence, the thesis of the book is something that really resonates with me. He says, the mark of a saint is not one who's reached perfection, but even when they have fallen, they have a burning desire to please the Lord. I would like to alter that a little bit. The mark of a saint is not one who has a burning desire to please the Lord, but also a burning desire to help the needy and the downtrodden. Friends, I guarantee you, this was John Dodge. I conclude with a story, a true story that took place in Mexico. It helped me after I lost my mom and dad in a short time and a number of other relatives. And I really truly believe in the essence of this story and this spirituality. This lady was a very devout Christian. Her husband was no longer practicing any faith religion, any faith tradition. He in his 50s developed a serious illness. He was always healthy and well. One day he got terribly ill, went to the hospital, and I don't know what the diagnosis was, but they told him he didn't have long to live. And she's asked a clergy person, with his permission, would he be willing to have the clergy person come? He came, he read some of the Psalms. He didn't try to proselytize or force religion on him. But somehow, he mustered up enough strength to call his 2 teenage children that day. And he lived about 45 minutes away from the hospital. When one got on the phone, he asked his other son, Tim, to also get on the phone, the other line. And he said, sons, I'd rather tell you this now before you come and visit. Your dad doesn't have much more time to live. And you know what we all do. Oh, Dad, no, you'll be fine. Everything will be hunky-dory. No, he said, I don't have too much longer to live, sons. But I'm going to ask a favor. Will you remember this? Always be good to your mom. Please, Dad, you don't have to tell us that. Always be good to one another. Dad, we promise we will. And sons, don't forget this final thing. Death doesn't stop loving. So Connie and Rick and Julie and Margaret and Gail and also Nick, to all family and friends, I think we need to realize today, and this is why it should be joy-filled, I think John is saying, I will continue to love you in my new home for all eternity. Amen. Amen.
I'm John's son, Rick, and before I start saying anything or saying something in my own voice, I want to thank everyone for being here and on a hot day in a church that meant so much to my dad. He, of course, people are familiar with the drawing he did of this church back in the early 1950s and how much he cherished the architecture and, of course, the people in it. My sister Julie and I actually went to church as kids down the street here in the Congregational Church. So my father did move around ecumenically, I suppose you could say that. And my father was a very spiritual person. Now I have a note here. First, I would like to read a little bit from my cousin David, John's nephew, who is in North Carolina and would have loved to have been here. He could not make it. And unfortunately, this print is so small, I am going to have to only read a little bit of it. It's just too small for me to read. And David Rogers grew up in Bedford. And David, like Julie and myself, I suppose you could say David grew up almost as a son to my mother and father in Bedford. It was all, as you know, a small town. We had lots of cousins. We had lots of uncles and aunts who lived in this town. So it was that beautiful connection of family that disappears somewhat as people fan out and go to other places to live, to work. And Bedford was a town that people really did know each other. My father moved here as age 2, I believe, from Littleton. Never quite clear on that. It was a town of about 2,000 people, so you can see the changes, but you can see also the same wonderful things that existed then as this church does. So I will read David's little note here, as much as I can see of it, because it's very... First, let me say I love you, my Uncle John. His body may be gone, but his spirit lives on, and you and I draw on that spirit when we are down or when we are up. John most usually was up and worked to make others such. John's last year was shared with a second loving family, a family which took him in as their own, a family which loved him and which he loved. John the man is honored for his life and care in giving to others and for others. He was a good son, loving, living next to his mom and dad. He provided much help and care as they aged. That's on Old Billerica Road. My grandfather, Richard Dodge, and his wife Hazel were his mother and father. My grandfather, Richard, was the volunteer fire department chief here for many years. And they resided next to us growing up on Old Billerica Road. He was a good husband, enjoying life and supporting a family, living a life for his children to emulate, instilling values and love. He was a good husband, sharing life with his wife, Fran, and her family, and providing difficult care in her, my mom's, declining years. John was not perfect, am I or you, but he was good. His devotion to the St. Francis house and the clothing needs of the homeless was drawn from deep within. David's a great guy. He's taking care of his wife, who also grew up in Bedford, farmer Pauline Sibley. Some of you may know the Sibley family, great people in Bedford. So I will talk a little bit about my dad, just very personal stuff. I found out, like, Margaret dearly left me a message last Wednesday on my cell phone. It was just so nice of you to call, Margaret. It was great. Unfortunately, I was in the middle of I do a volunteer guide at a historic house in Marblehead, and I was just finishing up my 3-hour stint every week, and I got the message, and so I start here. I volunteer as a guide at an historic house in Marblehead. I had just finished a tour and got the news of my dad's death. I would say I would not have been there, meaning the tour of the historic house. I would not have been there if Dad, 50 years ago, had not taken me on dozens, and we're talking about dozens, every old house around Boston, New Hampshire, historic houses. I remember doing that at age 5 to probably well into my teens, and how wonderful that was. Hadn't taken me to dozens of old houses all over New England. So I owe my love of history to Dad. Just as with history, we went to every art museum, and Dad would point out the beauty to me. Some of my favorite paintings when I go into the Museum of Fine Arts, where he and Connie also visited. But as a kid, we would go in there all the time. And there were paintings in there that even now when I see them, and they're not necessarily major paintings, sometimes they're just very personal paintings that I remember, as a teenager. So when they moved these paintings in the museum, I'm so like, wow, it's moved here, and so wonderful to see the paintings that I remember seeing as a kid with my dad. So just as with history, we went to the Every Art Museum, and Dad would point out the beauty to me. He knew every walking path in Bedford, Concord, and Carlisle. One of his great walking companions for about 20 years was a local resident in Bedford who you may know, John Riley, who was a great friend of my dad. They would go off almost every morning for years and years and years up to Great Meadows and the beauty of Concord, very close to where Julie and her husband Bob first lived when they were married. So beautiful. I encourage all of you to go up to Great Meadows and commune with nature up there. He knew every walking path in Bedford, Concord, and Carlisle. As a kid, he learned the lessons that nature can teach us. For over 60 years, he lived on the banks of the Shawshene River and saw its beauty. Some of his favorite spots as a kid are now gone, of course, but others are timeless, such as the Great Meadows mentioned and Punkatasset Woods. Truly amazing spaces. He grew up on the South Street, as they call it now, South Road, right just down the street here, a few houses from this church. And by the late 1920s, he was gathering stories that he would retell to all of us. Growing up, I knew he was in the war. He didn't talk about it, and that's not uncommon from all my friends' generations of their dads in World War II. They did not talk about it too often. Oh, except for the drawing lesson he took in occupied Japan from a elderly Japanese artist. He would talk about that. He had the drawings to prove it. You know, he was still almost just a teenager, interested in art and learning from an experienced teacher in Japan. How beautiful that must have been, and so tragic at the same time with the destruction all in Japan. When later on in his life, starting in the 1990s, he did break out of not telling stories about the war, and he organized and went to many of his Army units reunions all around the country. And when it was time to have the next one year, he said, let's do it in Boston. And I believe it was 1999. Maybe 50 or 60 people came. And my dad, as you know, loved history so much, he had to cram in every historic site within 30-mile radius of Boston to show these veterans that he loved so much. Of course, most of them are gone. We have wonderful pictures of the events. Dad liked simplicity in most things. Growing up as a kid in the 1920s, his mother, my grandmother, would bring him to the Shaker community up in Harvard, which was a very late Shaker community. It was started in the 1790s, but existed until about the 1920s, when a lot of it was broken up and sold off. Now it's, of course, Fruitland's museum up there. But in the 1920s, he went up with his mother, and of course, it's the simplicity of the Shaker community up there that he, I believe, tried to emulate in a lot of his daily living. I think that rubbed off on him throughout his life. He loved the ocean. You would have no idea how much he would drive out of his way to get good fried clams. And he loved particular places, Halibut Point up in Rockport, which I visit once in a while. It's so unbelievably beautiful. And of course, he loved Annisquam. He loved Bass Rocks up on Gloucester. He loved the fury of the ocean. He loved the calm of the ocean. He especially liked Nova Scotia. We, as children, went up there a few times. We went to Newfoundland once, back in the 1960s. That was probably the biggest car excursion anyone I would advise taking, just because it reaches its limits when you're in a car on dirt roads in Newfoundland for 2 weeks. But there was a special spot in my mom and dad's life every year. They would try to get down to the Cape, and they had the favorite spot in South Orleans, the famous Nauset Beach, when you're going out of Orleans Center down to South Orleans. And it's probably one of the more dramatic parts of Nauset Beach, just the rollers coming in, the huge waves. And they would go down to a favorite little motel the Nauset Knoll Motel. My mother could not stop talking about that place. She loved it so much. And I believe they went down for about 35 years there. It was very, very special. My mom and dad knew each other growing up. Where Marshall's and Whole Foods is down the street here was the Sefton family farm, something like 75 acres back to Page Road. They married in 1952. My sister Julie and I had a great 1950s and 60s. The photographs, to remind ourselves when we were children, are just very precious. I present to you that you should, cherish photography, from snapshots to anything else, because just that little image of one or two things can be so wonderful in memories. It was a Bedford of lots of aunts and uncles and grandparents, but of course it was a time of great change in Bedford. My mom's family stopped dairy farming in the early 1950s, and the Dodge family stopped selling Fords in the 1960s. My grandfather had a Ford dealership right next to my mother's farm. Dad adapted with change. After the war, he went to art school and worked as a technical illustrator for Raytheon early on. Did portrait photography as a sideline, but by the late 1950s was the manager of the family Sunoco station, as well as the former Ford dealership next door, right down the street. He worked long hours, but still came home for lunch every day, amazingly. That's when people did that. Art would enter his life again in 1969, 1970, when he gave up the businesses and started to concentrate on his growing collection of images he was acquiring. He was perhaps the first person, I don't know really anyone else who was doing it at the time, he was perhaps the first person to take old engravings, small engravings sometimes. He had acquired tens of thousands of them by the 1970s. Enlarged them up to, say, 10 feet, big mural size, and applied watercolors to the enlargement. By the mid to late 70s, his work was in demand by architects and designers, and no request was too obscure. So in other words, if an architect was coming to restore a building in Cambridge, which Cambridge was a popular spot for his work, often I see it an engraving of the building, say it was built in 1870, no one else had probably seen in 100 years, he would have it and he would enlarge it and hand color it. Oh, okay. Little paragraph glitch here. But just as he enjoyed traveling, he really, really, really did like Bedford. Everyone has a story to tell. He and my mom saw Julie. Julie married Bob, myself go off to UMass and then to live in the western part of the state. Things were good on Old Borica Road. He had built a house there with my mom in 1952. They moved in. My mom developed Parkinson's in the late 1990s, and Dad was an amazing caregiver. After 49 years of marriage, my mom died. Bedford almost lost my dad, too. He, soon after my mom's death, bought a house in lovely Annisquam. And then a month into that, he and Connie announced their wonderful marriage. Bedford gained another 12 years of my dad before he moved to Billerica up at Brightside and then to Burlington later on. Let's just say he came out of his shell a bit starting in the late 1990s. I could have never imagined him doing a TV show ever. And now when I go on YouTube, he's there, as a wonderful reminder of how his stories just touched so many people. It's a wonderful thing to have YouTube. You can just click on. It's a wonderful and a satisfying thing at the same time that it's a reminder of the stories that people had before, recorded history and things like that. I thank all of you for being here. Yesterday, my sister and myself, my niece and nephew, cousins were here down the street here. It was very, very poignant to hear wonderful stories. In closing, I would like to mention some people that were special in my dad's life. He was very touched by his neighbors on Old Burka Road, Mary Jane McGinnis, the Comley family, certainly, the Kretschkar family up the street. Jeff and Patty Wade were friends. Of course, Roger and Irene River, wonderful people. One of their best friends lived right down the street, grew up with my mother, Cynthia Weber, who passed away a good 20 years ago. They were best of friends. George Swallow, John and Irma Riley, Mimi Adler, my mother's and dad's close friend, Ginny Atwood, Al Fay, and of course, hundreds of others. Julie and I thank all of you for your love. It's just been, of course, sad. It's been joyous. I thank Father Louis for his wonderful, wonderful talk. I thank Megan. I thank Maureen at Bedford Funeral Home. It's just beautiful help. I thank Margaret and Gail for everything, and of course Connie. And Julie has known my dad longer than probably anyone in this room. Maybe second of all is Arthur Lyons. Arthur Lyons is my dad's sister, Nancy Dodge Lyons, and Arthur were married in this church in 1953. Arthur and his daughter Molly, very special people. So that's where I'm going to leave it. I thank all of you for the church here. It's wonderful to be in this church. My dad was I wouldn't say he was not religious, but he was spiritual. And I think that is sometimes the more important thing. And of course, this church did hold such special places. I can't imagine anywhere else having this service. Thank you very much.
Really listening to all of these stories is a joyous occasion. Mom, can you hear me? Mommy, can you hear me? Okay. Meister Eckhart, a medieval theologian and mystic, taught, if the only prayer you said in your whole life was thank you, that would suffice. So I would like to say, thank you, Connie, for bringing kind, funny, gifted John into our lives and for making us the Donovan Hartwell Stavropoulos branch of the illustrious Dodge family. You shared a deep and lovely bond that will never die. Thank you, Fran, for making your sweetheart of more than 50 years promise to remarry quickly. You so wanted him to be happy, and we did our best. Thank you, Papa, for decorating so many lives with your smile. You epitomized the phrase, "My heart goes out to you." By Meister Eckhart's standards, you led a life of prayer. And finally, thank you, Lord, for creating such an adorable man to begin with, and for letting him brighten up this world for 93 years. In the words of a kind and gentle man, John Brooks Dodge, my dear Papa, the world needs more love. The world needs more warmth, and most of all, The world needs more laughter.
I'd like to thank Megan and the family for including me in this wonderful service. A great tribute to John. Love, warmth, laughter. It was 62 years ago when I arrived in Bedford to serve my first full-time ministry at this first parish on the Common. A recent graduate of the St. Lawrence University Theological School and still single, I found a small apartment in a white house at 175 the Great Road, where a TD Bank now stands. Directly across the street was the Bedford Shopping Plaza, Bedford Motors, the Ford dealership owned by Dick Dodge, and next to it, the Sunoco service station, owned and operated by his son, John, the warm and generous man we honor here today. The Dodges were all active members and supporters of this first parish, with Dick a member of the three-person parish committee, and his wife Hazel, and their sons, and John, and his wife Bob, and his wife Julie, and the family that we see before us this morning. They were active here in a variety of ways, from helping initiate a couples club and discussion group to serving in our religious education program, whose classrooms were up here on the second floor on each side, and also serving on a work party to erect scaffolding and to paint the west side of this meeting house one Saturday. I think it was in one day. I always filled up my 1952 Chevy at John's station across the street, where you could always count on being greeted by his welcoming smile. And next door, his dad would show me the new Fords that were available. In the early fall of 1954, Bedford was struck by two hurricanes, Carol and Edna, and the damage was considerable. Early one morning, I was awakened by the lovely woman named Murdy Jones, who owned the home where I was renting my apartment. She was knocking on my bedroom door and saying that Hurricane Carol was bearing down upon us, and thought I should move my car from one spot in the driveway to a different spot, a less vulnerable spot. She was worried about my car being struck by an old elm. As the rains and winds picked up, I went outside to move my car, but as it turned out, her counsel was misguided. For the spot to which I moved it saw another old elm come crashing down on my car, essentially flattening it. And Dick Dodge offered to either repair it or sell me one of his new Fords. I did the latter eventually, and John, next door, always serviced it until we moved to the Midwest 3 years later. But I have to add that shortly after that hurricane, I was ordained in this sanctuary. I think it was October 26, 54, and at the reception, which was held upstairs, right there, I met my future wife, Martha, of now over 60 years. Great story, and I always kid John Gibbons about the need to put a plaque up there. In 1971, after serving our congregations in Cleveland and Ottawa, Martha and I came home to New England when UUA headquarters called me to the Department of Ministry at 25 Beacon Street. And so after living in Reading for 16 years, we relocated to her family's homestead on Boston Road in Chelmsford Center, just 8 miles up Route 4 from here. Soon, John began to get in touch with us again, telling us about his wife Connie as we caught up on each other's life stories. He discussed his expanding historical collections, his art, his concern for the homeless, and his son's, Rick's, work in the Berkshires. On one occasion, he and Connie invited Martha and me to join them for lunch in Bedford. At their home afterwards, he showed us his fascinating collections and shared in more detail his support of the St. Francis House and how close to his heart that was. We haven't seen each other for years since then, but John would occasionally call and we would talk over the phone. And in closing, I cannot improve on Megan's description of John, always full of stories, always ready to serve. John was truly humble and grand.
I'm also grateful I really got to know John quite well in recent years and really appreciated what a special person he was. Having been raised here in Bedford, John was the natural choice for being our town historian, and he was unquestionably the authority on all Bedford 20th century history. And actually, given his long life, John and his family were already an integral part of Bedford's history long before his death. Those of us that arrived here later in the 20th century, we could only read about and see photos of the Bedford where John grew up and a lot of photos of John himself growing up. So after the horse and buggy era ended early in the 20th century, John's dad, Richard Dodge, became the first Ford dealer in town, located where Reggio Sunoco is now. And John's first wife, Fran, grew up right next door on the farm on the Great Road, where Bedford Shopping Center, the marketplace, is now located. The display the Historical Society brought, I actually have a framed watercolor of Fran's farmhouse, and it's there. You can admire. Frankly, in my humble opinion, it was a lot nicer than what we've got there now. Anyway, John's family lived down South Road in a historic house, and he went to school in now historic Union School, back when it was actually pretty new. And after, of course, then he was part of U.S. history, what Tom Brokaw called the greatest generation, because he served with General Patton's Third Army in Germany and Czechoslovakia near the end of the war. And you heard his own bizarre story, single-handed capture of 18 German soldiers, and only John, the superb storyteller, could make a funny story out of that. So after the war, John took over running the service station and eventually his father's business, and also literally married the girl next door, Fran. So again, we have a nice picture. We also have photos of the old farm where it stood there. And of course, always a collector. He was collecting antique cars back in those days while he was studying to become an artist, and also he had probably the most extensive Valentine collection in existence. He showed that at the Historical Society on occasion. He got the word out in a variety of ways. He spoke at meetings. He was interviewed for the newspaper. He did oral histories, a lot of them on Bedford cable TV, which you all heard about, so on. Well, going through the Historical Society files, I found a few of his favorite tales that he'd prepared for use at this Historical Society's booth on a Bedford Day right after he'd become town historian. So I'm going to shift flavor of the meeting here a little bit by sharing some of John's tales one more time. Starting out, this is John's words. Bedford's proud place in our colonial history is well known, but there's also an enduring chapter to our history that I feel a special mission to convey, since I remember it very well. The tough times we're facing today are nothing compared with the 30s, but even then, we had our own reasons to laugh. One of them was the great hog swap. President Roosevelt had tried to boost the price of pork by giving the farmers incentives to reduce the size of their piggeries. During the Depression, Bedford's farmers didn't have 2 nickels to rub together, so they came up with a plan for the big hog swap to get the best of both worlds. Get the government's money and keep all the pigs. There were quite a few hog farmers in Bedford, and they'd be notified of an approaching inspection. So they all worked together, stay one step ahead of the inspectors by moving their pigs from one farm to the next, on the next. So when the inspectors arrived, they'd only find 20 or 30 hogs, because the other 100 just happened to be up visiting up the road to a neighboring farm. Well, it was quite a scene, all the pigs being moved around town in secret, and the whole town was in on it. Oh yeah, naturally, it's the boys will be boys stories that stand out most clearly in my memory. And interject here, these are all third-person stories about this boy, that boy. He's got so many details, I can't help but think some of those boys were named John. But anyway, like the time the ice cream truck pulled up to Stefanelli's in Bedford Center, and some of the boys helped themselves to ice cream while the driver was unloading. When Tilly Stefanelli caught the meeting out in the back lot, she made them promise never do it again if they didn't want her to call the police, or even worse, their fathers. The all-time rascal prize goes to the boy who lived on Hartford Street and once came to the assistance of a lady who lived in a house full of cats on Beacon Road. When one of the lady's cats went missing, she asked her young neighbor to search for the wandering kitty, and he successfully reunited the lady with her pet and was rewarded with 50 cents. Quite a haul in those days. So every now and then, he'd kidnap one of her cats. He'd take care of it in his cellar for a couple of days, and then after a suitable effort had been made to find it, he'd produce the cat and claim his reward. So, just as with the hog census, we will never really know whether she was wise to what was going on. The high point of the year was the Grange Fair that was held in the center of town for a few days each fall, concluding with an open-air concert on the final evening. Events included poultry and cattle judging, 3-legged races, and a doll carriage parade. One year I won 50 cents in the boys' bike race down Fletcher Road, but not all the boys used their energy so constructively. I remember one boy who dropped an egg in a spectator's back pocket, and another boy walked by and smashed it. By the time a boy was up on the Grange's balcony, where the baking contests were held, and he threw a whole Boston cream pie down another boy's head. And I can still hear the sound of the juicy tomato a boy threw as it landed in the tuba at the concert. That boy sounds an awful lot like you-know-who. But if I was under the impression that all these years that the local boys were devils and the girls were angels, that was revised a few years ago when I was telling some stories at the Council on Aging. One of the pastimes I recalled was how 20 or so boys, we'd all go skinny dipping in the Elm Brook and the meadow beyond upstream of the train tracks. Imagine my surprise when a local lady confided that 70 years ago, she was one of a group of young ladies with binoculars who were watching the whole thing from the bushes. John will miss you. Thank you.
Now is the time in our service for community remembrances. And if any of you would like to speak, you are most welcome. I'll bring the mic to you if you would tell us your name. And I encourage brevity because that will matter, not because a longer story isn't worthwhile. Don't be shy because John loved a good story. He carried them for us, and now we too are keepers of the years. Short but sweet, and do tell us your name.
I remember John Dodge. My name is Ron Green. I remember John Dodge, and my memory's a little fuzzy. I don't know if this happens to anybody else here, but my memory does get a little fuzzy about an event that I saw so frequently. But I remember him in a rainy, sludgy snowstorm with sleet and just an awful day, standing at the polling place with this can for St. Joseph's at St. Francis. And I said to myself, if he can do that, that's worth $5. And ever since that time, I've made sure that I look for John and put some money into his container. Foul weather and fair, John was always there working for St. Francis. The second story is when I took some, the parish here has a tradition of sending little plates of cookies out to the people who are infirmed or getting on in years or don't see many people out. But I took a plate of cookies up to John Dodge. We spent probably an hour talking about Bedford and the life, and some of his memories were a little vague, but he remembered Connie. And every 5 minutes or so, he'd come back to Connie and the difference that Connie made in his life, the difference that he made to him to find love so late in life, and the improvement, the wonderful companionship that they shared. It's a real testament to somebody living his life to the last day, and it's something that I'll remember.
Hi, I'm Ellen Michaud, and approaching the year 2000, I don't know if you remember this, but anyway, other towns were celebrating the year 2000, but Bedford was kind of dragging its feet. They didn't seem to be able to get up speed to do something about it. I said, if this town can't celebrate the year 2000 with some kind of, show of its history and its people, I said, I'm going to get out my pots and pans and bang on them at midnight 2000. Some people didn't appreciate that because they had to go to work the next day. But anyway, that was not necessary because John and Connie Dodge, well, Connie first and then John, they met at those meetings that we had for the year 2000 celebration. And it was so sweet because at a party that we had celebrating what we had accomplished and what we were going to do at Doris and Chris Kroll's house, John and Connie were there. And they had just gotten engaged. And John was thinking of moving to Ennisquam because it was an artist colony before he met Connie. But Connie drew him back. And you know what she said about John? She said, I adore that man. And they were so great about, they gave contributions to the celebration, and Connie had some historical things that she gave. So they were very much involved in the town, and they have given so much to this town together.
Hi, I'm Karen LaFrazier, and I am the executive director at St. Francis House. And so my memories are actually memories that I wanted to share with you about the people that received all of those thousands of coats over the years, and what that actually meant in the lives of so many people that John loved, but maybe but didn't know personally. And so just to briefly say that it was his spirit, it was his love that actually put a warm embrace, more than just a coat, around the thousands of men and women that come to us. And I can't even begin to tell you the importance, not just of that coat, but of that expression of love, because it truly is in that space of love that we're able to see so many men and women change the trajectory of their lives. And it was because of John and the catalyst that he was that made it possible for all of you to love the men and women as well. So we're eternally grateful to John and to all of you. So thank you very much.
I'm Alethea Yates. Many of you know me as Lee Yates. I just want to mention to the out-of-towners that some of John's wonderful hand-colored old photographs of Bedford and prints can be seen in the town hall upstairs and downstairs, and in the lobby of the police station. They're right over here. So before you go take a stroll and see them.
Every time I saw my name is Gavin Bennett, and every time I saw my when I went to my grandparents, I saw him, and he always came right through the door, and he always started whistling at the dogs and started doing some stories, and it was really fun to see him every single time.
I hope for more sharing of stories after the service. And I think Father Louis is going to lead us with a prayer that's printed in our order of service here.
I was told that this prayer, it meant so much to John, and I think really John captured the spirit of St. Francis of Assisi, who reverenced all people and especially had a great care for the poor and the disenfranchised. So friends, let us pray this together now. O Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is discord, unity. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is error, truth. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is sadness, joy. Where there is darkness, light. O divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen. Thank you.
The words to America the Beautiful can be found in your order of service. They were chosen by John because John so loved the beauty and the ideals of this country, brotherhood and sisterhood, giving everyone a chance, appreciating and protecting the natural world all around us, and working for a better world. May we all be a part of that. And I invite you to stand as you're willing and able. like John, not die an unlived life. Like him, may we not live in fear of falling or catching fire. May we choose to inhabit our days, to allow our living to open us, to make us less afraid, more accessible, to loosen our heart until it becomes a wing, a torch, a promise. As John so chose, may we choose to risk our significance, to live so that which came to us as seed goes to the next as blossom, and that which came to us as blossom goes on as fruit. Good people, emerge out of this service with something to accompany your sadness. Walk into time and let it heal. Walk into nature and let this beautiful day enliven you. Walk toward other people and share your exuberance and your stories. You are still needed, so live on, give on. John, rest your soul. Your love and legacy lives on in us. We will not forget you. We will share your love and your wisdom wherever we go. May it be so. Amen.